So may I now request Dr. Sampadananda Mishra to present his paper. His paper is entitled Thoughts on Education, Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo. Dr. Mishra is the director of Sri Aurobindo Foundation for Indian Culture at Pondicherry.
16th of December every year, on this day, the Center of International Education, Sri Aurobindo Ashram, reopens after 1.5 years of half months of vacation. A very unique school. When your child gets admitted into this school, on the application form you will see, if you want a child to seek for a job, if you want a certificate, this is not the school for you. A school which has no examination, no fixed syllabus, and the children grow beautifully. With 18 years study in the school, they come out as graduate, very bright, honest, and quite intelligent. A system perhaps nowhere exists on the earth, and a system which is based on the integral system of education laid down by Sri Aurobindo and the mother. What happens? How do they manage then this whole teaching? If you look at the whole principle of education on which this school is running and compare it with the present system of education that exists outside that school, everywhere else in India and outside. Let me just give you a brief description of some of the major problems in the present system of education, and most of you are aware of what are the problems. The present system of education mostly is, works like a factory based on the industrial mindset, designed by the industrial mindset, where the children, the students are taken like raw materials, and the outcome is few or several certified professionals to fit into the needs of mechanistic society. The whole aspect of the personality, what should the education system should have given, is missing there. I'll tell you a story, which I'm always fond of telling this and sharing this story. There's a dialogue between a baby camel and the mother camel. The baby camel asks the mother camel, "Mom, why do we have big horns on the back?" And the mother camel says, "You know, my dear child, since we are desert animals, and this helps like a storage of water, and we can live without water for a long time in the desert, and this is the water storage system that's given to us." Then the second question the baby camel asked, "Mother, why do then we have long legs, tall legs with rounded hooves?" He said, "It's for the same reason that it helps us walking in the desert sand, which no other animals can do the way we can do." This is fine, I understand. Then why do we have long, thick eyelashes? He says, it's for the same reason that it's a great protection for the sands entering into the eyes. And the whole discussion is taking place in a particular situation that you will come to know from the next question which the baby camel is putting to the mother camel. The baby camel says, "I understand that this horns helps us like our water storage system, and the tall legs with rounded hooves, it helps us walking in the desert. And the thick eyelashes are the protection for our eyes. But then mother, what the hell are we doing in the zoo?" So this is where I put the present system of education where you have certified professionals or you come out with some certificate or some skill, but in a way it gives you the right place. What happens to your creativity, your personality, your latent power that is there? So when we come in contact with the thoughts of Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo on education, we learn that both of them laid much stress on the flowering of an all-round personality, perfection and integration of personality. They pointed out that there are in us not one but various personalities. A true system of education sincerely takes care of an integral and harmonious growth of these personalities. But it is disappointing that for several decades, the modern system of education here in India and everywhere else, to a greater extent, has ignored the domain of the growth of personality. And as a result, most of us, after our formal education is over, possess shrouded personalities, and most often we are engaged in the work that has no correspondence with our real genius, with our inner delight of existence. And thus, we live in deep suffering, separated from ourselves. This is what I wanted to illustrate through this story of the baby camel and the mother camel. Another important aspect in the educational philosophy and the principles laid down by Sri Aurobindo and the mother and Swami Vivekananda is what we have been talking about, perfection. If education means bringing out the perfection already within the man, what we need to understand is what is meant by perfection. What exactly is this perfection that lies within us, that we need to manifest this perfection? Is perfection something, an end by itself? Is perfection is some kind of skill and excellence that we need to achieve? If you look again in the light of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, the perfection is something like a peak. When you reach a peak, another peak is visible. And there is no direct flight from one peak to the other peak. You have to go through all the ups and downs to arrive at another peak from where another peak is visible. And there is no end to perfection. So perfection is a kind of stage. And this is how Sri Aurobindo explains the whole cycle of the Yuga system, the Chatur Yuga. So each Yuga is within, all the Yugas are within each Yuga. So perfection is something achieving a stage where you realize the ever-perfect nature of your own soul. But this ever-perfect nature of yourself is veiled by the imperfections and impurities of the instruments through which it grows. So in the light of Swami Vivekananda, in the light of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, it's a child-centered education where the child is considered as an evolving soul. And there, then we need to understand what is the role of the teacher, what type of subjects that we should teach and how we should teach. So in this slide, I'm going to read out certain things and discuss some things and also pose certain questions before you all. Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo are perhaps the two greatest representatives of Indian Renaissance, who had envisioned a holistic system of education that can liberate the humanity from all its limitations. A true system of education aims at bringing perfection that lies within every evolving soul. This is what both Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo professed. This idea of bringing the perfection within was the keynote in Swami Vivekananda's thought on education. Here the question comes, what is meant by perfection? Is perfection something, what I said, or skillfulness, or sometimes it is translated in the words of the Gita Yoga, Karmasu Kaushalam. But again, this Kaushalam is what? Mere excellence or something else. So, perfection in a higher sense is to grow conscious of and realize the soul's own ever-perfect nature. The soul, the real essence within everyone is ever-perfect, but its ever-perfect nature is veiled by the imperfections and impurities of the instruments through which it can grow to its fullness. What are these instruments? Body, mind, and life. These three are the major instruments, but these instruments need to be perfected, and their full potentialities are to be realized. It is by strengthening and sharpening these instruments that the capacity to learn and discover the knowledge within is possible. This is what, according to Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo, a true education does: the sharpening and strengthening the instruments, the different faculties of consciousness. But if you look at the entire modern system of education, hardly any importance is given to this aspect, sharpening and strengthening the inner faculties like concentration, observation, creativity, imagination, and the will, the thought, and different latent powers and many hidden powers which are there within us, hidden potentialities which are within us. Let me tell you another story which perfectly illustrates how the modern system of education is operating. There's a man who was passing through a forest village. So he found that another man, a woodcutter, is cutting a small thin tree. And something fascinated, and this man stood, waited to see the tree falling down, and he had to wait nearly 45 minutes, whereas the whole process should have taken only 5 to 10 minutes. Then he goes near the woodcutter and finds that his axe is completely blunt. Then he asks this man, "Why don't you sharpen the axe?" He said, "Where is time? I have to cut trees." So everyone is busy cutting trees with blunt instruments. There's no time. Imagine, now this is where Swami Vivekananda said concentration. And with the power of concentration, everything can be achieved. If you sharpen this power, if you empower this faculty of concentration, then anything can be achieved through this. But hardly we pay any attention to it. He says what can be achieved in months can be achieved in few hours if you have the power of concentration. And he said the concentration, the power of concentration is the essence of education, but we hardly cultivate it. So when the true education, according to Swamiji and also Sri Aurobindo, make a man man, but not a machine. Therefore, Swamiji wanted a man-making, character-making, and life-building education. And you know the Vedic dictum, Manurbhava, Janaya Vidyam Janam. And to achieve this, we need to concentrate on the development of these inner faculties of and perfection of the instruments. In one of the writings, Swamiji says, if I had to do my education over again and had any voice in that matter, I would not study facts at all. I would develop the power of concentration and detachment, and then, with a perfect instrument, I could collect the facts at will. Such a powerful remark, such a powerful statement, that with the power of concentration, then I'll just say Mother and Sri Aurobindo in the system of integral education laid a great stress on this developing this power of concentration, where Mother says that concentration is the key to success in every field of life. And with this power, you can become the best athlete, you can become the best poet, you can become even the best, highest saint with this power of concentration. The Sri Aurobindo adds a little bit more to this power of concentration when he says that what is meant by concentration. Usual understanding of concentration is that we gather all our energy and focus it on one single point or single idea. Sri Aurobindo says this is a kind of exclusive concentration which is very much necessary But what is indispensable is a multiple concentration faculty, where when you are focused on one aspect, the rest is not ignored. And this is indispensable. And you can find in the ancient tradition, the tradition of Ashtavadhanam and Shatavadhanam, which is existing in most part of the South India, especially in Andhra Pradesh and to some extent in Karnataka. This whole art of multiple concentration and how they have, these Ashtavadhanis, how they have developed this power of multiple concentration. What was the key? And when I have done kind of first-hand research into the Ashtavadhana, this art of multiple concentration, and how we can implement this art of multiple concentration in the mainstream education, what are the ways. So there I have interviewed a lot of Ashtavadhanis, and the key to the success, what they say, how they have achieved, is that the stillness of the mind. How many times in our education system we teach the children to still the mind? In silence everything is learned. So how to silence the mind? The silencing the mind is one of the important aspects in this educational system. But how to do it? How to implement it in the educational situation? So with this, let me give you a brief idea about the principles of integral education that is developed by Sri Aurobindo and the mother. In the writings of Sri Aurobindo on education, we find a constant insistence on detailed perfection of human mind, life and body. And the principles and methods advocated by Sri Aurobindo as well as the mother have a profound bearing on the psychic and spiritual education. These two domains bring into picture all that is central to value-oriented education and to higher and profounder elements of human psychology. So in the system of education developed by Sri Aurobindo and the mother, equal importance is given to mental education, vital education, physical education, and above these, there is a psychic education and a spiritual education. In this integrated system, there is no denial of anything that can contribute to the full flowering of the faculties of personalities. The psychic and spiritual development cannot be effected without effecting the high-level development of the body, mind, and life. And at the same time, the perfection of the body, life, and mind cannot be attained without the help of the powers of psychic and spiritual consciousness. With regard to the mental education, the system has to take care of the development of the power of concentration, development of the capacities of expansion, wideness, complexity, and richness, organization of ideas around a central idea, control of thoughts, and the development of the power of thoughts to the extent that in the end, one has the ability to think what one wants and when one wants. Development of mental silence, perfect calm, and more total receptivity to inspirations coming from higher regions of the thing. And this is where in one of his writings, Sri Aurobindo, The Brain of India, he says, the ruin of India, the main cause of the ruin of India is not lack of poverty, because India was never poor, neither materially nor spiritually. The whole world came to India, the whole invasion, just to loot, to take. In spite of that, India is the richest country materially. India was never poor. So poverty is not the cause of ruin of India. This is spirituality. Lack of spirituality is also not the cause, because India never lacked spirituality. What then is the cause of ruin of India? He points out, he says, it is India has lost it through the course of its evolution, the power of original thinking, where he is referring to the intuitive knowledge. The whole knowledge system, if you look at the Vedic tradition of the whole knowledge system of India, the whole rich tradition. So it was developed, discovered intuitively and developed logically. And this intuitive knowledge, the power of original thinking, we have lost. And that is the main cause of our suffering and our ruin. This is what is pointed out by Sri Aurobindo. And how do we get back to that intuitive knowledge or that original power of thinking is a methodized process of perfecting these inner instruments or the different faculties of the consciousness. With regard to the vital education, what is important is to develop and utilize the sense organs and to become master of one's character, and in the end to achieve its transformation. One more thing important in the vital education is to develop the will of the individual and to encourage the exercise of the will, in which what is valued most is not the result but the application and doing one's best. With regard to the physical education, the body needs to be trained in a methodical and detailed manner with rigor, control and discipline of the function of the body, a total methodical and harmonious development of all parts and movements of the body, and the rectification of the defects, deformities, if there is any. These are the three principal aspects of the physical education. And if you go to Sri Aurobindo Ashram, the Center of Education there, the importance which is given to the physical education. Throughout the year, not a single day physical education has any off day, whether it rains or whatever happens. It's throughout the year the children have to do the physical education to have control over the movements of the body and to grow conscious of the body consciousness. And apart from this, Sri Aurobindo and Mother also have spoken about the psychic education, spiritual education, and even supplemental education. One of the, again, most important contributions of Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo and the Mother is reconciling the principles of education with yoga. So to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, the yoga and education are not two different things. So if you ask, then what is the book that I should follow to know the educational principles of Sri Aurobindo, then I would suggest that go to Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga, which is of around 1,000 pages book, where you can find a complete system of education or the principles, the methods of where yoga and education are not two different things. The same also in the case of Swamiji. So one of the most important contributions of Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo in the field of education is that both of them have reconciled the principles of education with that of yoga. Yoga, Swamiji has said, may be regarded as a means of compressing one's evolution into a single life or a few months or even a few hours of bodily existence. Education too, in its deeper sense, is a rapid psychological process towards perfection, a search for knowledge, for values. It is also an uncovering of the layers of faculties, cultivation of them, and perfection of them. It is a process of the discovery of self, as you find in the Upanishads, Atmava or Drashtavya, Mantavya, Shrodavya, Nividhasyatavya, or Atmanam Vidhi. And it aims at a true self-knowledge, which can liberate from all kinds of bondage. Savidya ya vimuktaye. Education, in this sense, is a search for that knowledge which would fulfill oneself individually and as a harmonious member of this universe. This is what the yoga also aims at achieving. Sri Aurobindo says, by yoga, we mean a methodized effort towards self-perfection by the expression of the potentialities latent in the being and a union of the human individual with the universal and transcendent existence we see partially expressed in man and in the cosmos. This gives us an understanding, according to Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo, yoga and education are one and identical process. Sri Aurobindo has pointed out at one place that the teacher has to be a yogi. And again, the three foundational principles or fundamental principles of integral system of yoga, wherein the first principle Sri Aurobindo said that nothing can be taught. A teacher is not a teacher but a facilitator, as a guide, as a supervisor. He doesn't teach, he doesn't instruct anything. He has to be a guide, he has to observe the child and help in the manifestation, in the growth of the child. And there he said that the teacher has to have the yogic attitude. He has to be a yogi. All that he says he has to live that truth. It's not that like what I say, do, what I do, don't do. It's not that type of teacher, but the teacher has to be a living example of all that he says. So this is how the discipline, the character building, and the whole education process goes on, because the teacher is the living example of all that he says. The teacher has to be a yogi. Swamiji also expected the monks to take care of the education of all those who are in need of education. Sri Aurobindo considered education as a lifelong process, and the secret of this lifelong education is the aspiration for progress and perfection. He emphasized that thirst for progress and a zeal for self-perfection should govern the rhythm and law of self-development. This desire for progress is, as Swamiji says, implanted in every man. We need to cultivate that, make use of that. To progress is to remain young perpetually, and constant progress comes by perpetual education. It's not education by few years. You cannot compress education by few years. It's a whole lifelong process. Yoga, as explained by Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo, is a means by which one can achieve greater perfection of the body, mind, and prana or life. There are great hidden faculties and powers which can be awakened by methodized effort. Not even that. There are great psychological superconscious states and powers which are central to the creative and integral perfection of the personality. And one can grow conscious of those states and powers by means of yoga. But yoga is not a part-time occupation. It must be taken up as a sovereign and central occupation, and it must govern and permeate every aspect of life and its activity. Both Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo introduced life-affirming yoga in which life is meaningful, and life itself could be so organized as to serve as a natural means of education. So a complete yogic education is a lifelong process. This education fathoms into the secret of the true person behind all personalities and discovers there the real power of integrating the fullness of all personalities. This reveals the secret of perpetual youth. This refers to a constant harmonization of our outer world and circumstances with the inner needs of the manifestation of powers of the real person seated deep within us. This secret of eternal youth, as envisioned by Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo, is the inner soul of true education and yoga. And one more contribution, important contribution of Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo in the field of education is that past as the foundation. While speaking about education and yoga, both Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo referred to past as the foundation. If we look at the ancient Indian literature, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and other related texts in which we can get glimpses of ancient Indian education, we find that the whole educational process had resulted from the understanding of the fullness of life. Secondly, for the rishis or the seers of the past, it was inner spiritual experiences, the deeper realizations and integral knowledge, everything that served as the foundation for the content of education. And thirdly, what is important in education was the individual and collective perfectibility of the human personalities. And we find a greater synthesis of the principles and aims of ancient Indian system of education in the writings of Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo on yoga and education. It is noteworthy that both Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo had perceived an uplifting and inspiring model in the ancient system of education. When Swamiji speaks about the teacher, he gives the example of Satyakam Jawal, who was taught by Hariprabhu Gautama, described in the Chandogya Upanishad. So they wanted the youths of India, and they advocated for free India, a national system of education rooted in the ancient Indian conception of education. At the same time, they also advocated that this system of education must cater into the ideals of internationalism and universality. They wanted the youths of India to relive the presence and guidance of the wise and benign and courageous rishis who had sown in the soil of India the seeds of perennial inspiration. They wanted to recreate centuries of living souls who could be fostered by teachers like Vasishtha and Vishwamitra, Vamadeva and Bharadwaja. They wanted the ancient Indian concept of education should not only be revisited by free India, but should also be resurrected, renovated and perfected by the aid of all that is modern and useful, by all that is Indian and universal. We must assimilate all that is beautiful in others, but while doing so, we must not cut ourselves off from our own root. Swamiji says, each must assimilate the spirit of the others and yet preserve his individuality and grow according to his own law of growth. And we find a very detailed exposition of this in one of the writings of Sri Aurobindo titled Indian Culture and External Influence, which is a part of his book Foundations of Indian Culture. And most importantly, both Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo advocated not to relegate to the past and get fixed there, but to use past as a springboard to lead towards a bright and luminous future. Sri Aurobindo says in his writings on the national system of education, the past is our foundation, the present our material, and the future our aim and summit. Each must have its due and natural place in a national system of education. So with this, I close my presentation.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Mishra, for drawing our attention to the philosophies of education of these two brilliant minds. So I guess we can spend around 6 or 7 minutes for discussion. So since we couldn't take up any question on Professor Sen's presentation, so we can talk together, and please come up with your comments or queries if you want. Yes, Professor.
A few points only. We've had discussion about Romarola, Vivekananda, Rabindranath. In that connection, I have only one point to make sure that Rabindranath, Romarola, Mahatma Gandhi, and Paramahansa Dev, all are in one sense, in a very good sense, pacifist. Though at that time in India there was brewing militant nationalism, but they are all against it. They are all pacifist. But one very important point we tend to miss is there is a deep difference only on one point. At that time there was a lot of discussion, differences, and attempt at formulating the differences on the concept of nationalism. But so far as the political nationalism is concerned, a lot of discussions were there and differences were there also, but only on cultural nationalism, which was the root of Vivekananda's classic patriotism. That cultural nationalism, they are all agreed. But so far as the political nationalism is concerned, a lot of discussions was going on there. I am not going into detail, but only one point I will say. There's one great importance between Romarola and Rabindranath. They were in favor of internationalism. And Romarola tried his best to bring to international scenario Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi stood his battle line. They never succeeded. He never became international. He says, no, my position is India. And if my experiment with India succeeds, we can think of it later on, whether we can later on. And Rabindranath's internationalism are so, in a sense, so militant anti-nationalism. So Rabindranath was so averse to nationalism that he said all the things, bad things that could be said about Japan. Rabindranath said we should be alarmed with Japan. Japan's nationalism is of such a thing that he was alarmed that Japan not only attempted to attack China, if Japan succeeds, Japan will attack India. This was his intention. And then on one fine morning, after Okakura came to Vishwaharati and his meeting and his appreciation for the aesthetics of Japan, Rabindranath changed his stance. So that internationalism and nationalism, this debate was very important there. And other things which I will relate to it, to Joy and many other people, perhaps you also, You are constantly missing one link. You have said all these people, but two important omissions I find regularly. There is Bankim Chandra and Satish Chandra Mukherjee. And Satish Chandra Mukherjee was considered by Mahatma Gandhi as his teacher. And I told you that at that time 4 different reform movements were going on, and the political nationalist movement was actually the fruition of the education movement at that time. The Calcutta University boycott, and Shubhoda is not there. National Council of Education or National Education Movement started around 1897, and so this was not being taken note of. That these are the two things which we should take into account very much, and only just for that. That's what it
We can take the questions together and then.
Yes.
I hesitate to add to anything to these very emotionally satisfying presentations we have had, except a footnote to what Professor Mukhopadhyay just now said. Professor Mukhopadhyay, and there's a slight chronological problem. You are quite right in saying that Tagore was indeed, you might even say, militant pacifist. In that, he was so much against nationalism in its unregenerate form, and he was so much for internationalism. Quite correct. However, there was no overnight change. What happened was that there is that the Okakura phase precedes the phase where he is critical of Japanese nationalism and of nationalism in general. Okakura's visit took place at the time when Mr. Sen is talking about that. We have that generation, that period. In the first 2 decades of the 20th, first decade of the 20th century, there were these exchanges which took place. And we are quite right in saying that he was so much appreciative of Japanese culture, civilization, and particularly aesthetic form. But it is 1914, is the outbreak of the First World War. And generally the depredations of the Japanese in China, particularly in Manchuria, Japanese imperialism in China in other words, which turned him against Japan's type of nationalism, in which he attributes to European nationalism. And he says our national patriotism is different. And this happened, sir, in 1917, when he tours Japan and lectures there, and then goes to England. And in both places, of course, he is highly unpopular because nationalism at its peak in these two countries at that time because of the war in Japan and the impending war in America. But he kind of embraced unpopularity rather than give up his militant pacifism, as we have very correctly put it.
I will not answer to it, but only one thing. There was a series of conferences and publication came out to be 50 years of Indo-Japan relationship. And there I got that maybe that this change of idea or attitude to Japan was definitely due to Okakura influence, and as you see, it will be the idea.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
It's not a question, but when Professor Gu was giving his talk, I was reminded of a French mathematician, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, André Weil. And during the Second World War, there was this compulsorily wanted to join the war, and he refused, and he cited Bhagavad Gita as his inspiration for not joining the war. He said that the Second World War is a just war, only France is fighting for a just cause, but he cannot join because he has to stick to his Swadharma, which is not war but which is doing mathematics. And he was imprisoned. So I was just reminded of this. He was also French and one of the giants of 20th century mathematics, Andre Bell.
And all the militants in India were carrying, when a militant nationalist carrying a Bhagavad Gita. All the system.
Gita was a defense of war, wasn't it?
Right.
Professor Said, if you want to-
Fantastic thing. Yeah.
There cannot be an answer standing between me and Professor Mukhopadhyay. That's sir, on the other side. But I'll just give one or two anecdotes. One thing, I think with Andrew Weil, we also have Oppenheimer on the other side, having another version of Gita. So we have different versions of Gita having different logic and rationality in different parts of the world. Even Enrico Fermi was slightly interested in the Gita, and in the atom bomb, whether the Manhattan project was getting complete. Just for precision, he was taking out the atomic circuits out once more just to check. And later he made a footnote about Oppenheimer's obsession with the Gita, and finally he fell in trap to that, if you call that a trap. So these are various versions. I think diversions are always there in someone's personality, and if diversions lead to evolution and growth and higher perfection, it's the most welcome for. Like this life of Subhash Chandra Bose, his journey through the Transasia, cutting through the Karakorams, going through the passes, meeting a group of people who are called terrorists these days, the Mujahids, who helped Subhash Bose out through the Central Asia, and heading for Italy, finally landing up in Germany, and meeting a man who becomes a man of controversy in the Second World War. That does not put Subhash Bose, in a different body as a personality. What Netaji is doing is to go around in different parts of the world, getting pictures and standpoints. He says, if for the independence of India, that's a statement which is often quoted, I want to shake the devil, I will do that. So these are always there. I think there are a lot of instances we need to check on that, because the same house where mother was staying in Japan, on the upper floor, at the same time, Rabindranath was also there in the ground floor. Same time. And there is a lot of letters following that stay of Rabindranath and Mother Meera in Tokyo, going through the imperial palace and everything. And the epistles that we find in those letters could be probably a guiding light into the discussion which just arose right now. And even Swamiji was not in favor of a lot of things about Japan. And Swamiji didn't like the sumo part of Japan, which is still not a very good thing. Swamiji did not like the way Japan handled the later parts of Buddhism. It's there in his epistles. But in fact, Swamiji was not that interested in the Buddhist part of Japan. Swamiji was more interested in the commune part of Japan, in its industrial ecology, in its farmstead, homestead economy, the balance between an absorption of international culture and also retaining the roots at the same time, not just in life, but also in its products, also in its product design, also in its various industrial designs. So even Swamiji's focus on Japan, I shouldn't say be sectoral, but it was like on certain aspects only. Swamiji was very careful about giving sweeping statements, and Rabindranath was probably equally that also. But we need to check along all these lines. And I think more than, sir, I don't know, but the little that I know, more than Okakura's influence on Rabindranath, there are two other personalities in the house of Tagore. One was Abanindranath, but more than Abanindranath, it was Gogendranath, who knew tempera, which was the wash style. Govinda is not here, she's an expert. So the tempera, the wash style of Japan, which probably Gogendranath, there was one picture in that slide of Rabindranath going to the Himalayas. The picture of the Himalayas on the left bottom was by Gogendranath. So these are the pictures which follow the Japanese style. And Abanindranath got it from Gogendranath. And he did most of his other paintings like Shah Jahan and all that on tempera. So these were like Japanese influences in the house of Tagore already, with or without the influences of Rabindranath or Okakura coming in. So these are like just facts and figures which I'm just bringing in, not as an answer to
But also,
here.
Abanindranath's
Yeah.
nationalism
Yeah.
and Rabindranath's internationalism,
Yeah.
they are very much known.
Yeah, very much known. So
Because
Abanindranath
Rabindranath was much more international
Yeah, yeah.
than Rabindranath.
Abanindranath played a very interesting role, because Abanindranath and Gogendranath, let us open up a little bit. Abhinandannath and Bhoganandannath were the two figureheads in the house of Tagore who were not exclusive ambassadors of the Brahmo movement. Rather, they had greater connections with the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement. In fact, Bhoganandannath used to come to Belur Math quite a number of times and have a discussion with the monks, and there is a whole history of that. So I think we need to look into all this.
Since we have another session after a short tea break, so can I introduce Dr. Mishra? Would you like to say a few words about the comments that? Okay. Okay, so thanks Dr. Hussain and thanks Dr. Mishra for your very interesting presentations, and thank you all for your introductions. So we will have a short tea break for 10 minutes maybe, and then we will come back for the last session. Thank you.